All right, so welcome everyone to today's online course lecture for the Adaptation Planning and Practices Forest Carbon Management course. I'm your guest speaker today. Todd gave me the keys to the car, so I hope I don't break it. But you'll be my witness if that happens. Don't tell mom. Today's session is session 5, identifying adaptation strategies, approaches, and tactics. And wow, I cannot believe we've been together for 5 weeks. This is fantastic. So thank you all for continuing to show up and ask such awesome questions. As always, just a nice reminder that if you have any questions, just random stuff, either about your project or literature related, or you just have a really interesting carbon forestry management question that you want to ask, feel free to ask us. We're here to be your point people for that. You're sort of your phone a friend, your help desk. So definitely take us up on that if you haven't already. I had some awesome meetings with folks this week, and I really enjoyed learning about your projects. And all of you are really thinking about your management from really in a robust way and from several different perspectives. So feel free to, take us up on this offer to really go into the rabbit hole on something that you're really thinking about right now. Okay, so today's agenda, we'll do a really quick recap on step 3, which is something that we did talk about in discussion last week, but it's kind of abrupt. So just recap that. And then we'll dive right into more of an overview on adaptation options and adaptation actions, because tomorrow you'll have an opportunity to join a guest lecture with Todd to really go into the weeds on the forest carbon and climate adaptation component of the course. So I'm going to set the stage and get you thinking about that, plug you into the right part of the curriculum, and then I'll hand it over to Todd tomorrow to really take it away. Okay, so for a quick, refresh, it's been a while, I'm sure, since we're working on your workbook. For some of you, I know that you haven't logged in yet, and so I've been handing out new passwords to folks. So please start using the online adaptation workbook if you haven't already. But if it's not your thing, also please let us know, because we have alternative modes for you to use the adaptation workbook, like on paper or in the Excel spreadsheet format. So definitely reach out to us if it's just not working for you on that platform. Okay, sorry, those are my pitches. Back to step 3. Last week, we talked about step 3, and this was the opportunity in the workbook to connect the dots between those climate change vulnerabilities and your management goals and your objectives, and sort of to bring them all together. And what we really asked you to do was to, really consider, I have my goals, I have my objectives, I've thought about how my landscape might be vulnerable to different climate changes over time, added pressures that could exacerbate, some of those challenges that I'm already experiencing. And what we asked you to do in this step was really just document what are those challenges that maybe you're experiencing now that you anticipate, worsening in the future, but also to, on the flip side, start thinking about opportunities, because, ecosystems will continue to develop over time despite the climate change pressures. And so we want you to really be thinking ahead and thinking about clear opportunities for you either to get stuff done in a more timely fashion or at different times of the year than you normally would, or maybe opportunities to, do something a little bit different. And so in the case that I have here on the slide, this is sort of thinking about how, climate change presents added challenges based on our current management style. So you might think, well, I'm going to have even more invasive species, a shorter window for harvesting, and probably more of the species that are on my site will be at risk. Bummer. Like, those are huge challenges, right? But on the flip side, there are some opportunities in that if you have warmer conditions that are lasting for a longer period of time, and maybe greater amounts of moisture at different times of the year, you might be able to get away with planting new species that are more adapted to those conditions. And that longer growing season could also play into your benefit, because it could mean more growth. right? So it's going to help us achieve some of our goals and our objectives. But it really is about step 3 is documenting those ideas and then putting it into a balance sheet to understand, based on our current management, how feasible are our goals and our objectives. And very likely your goals and your objectives are feasible, but they may require a little finessing, right? And the objective component, just to make sure you're not putting yourself too tightly in a corner where you won't be able to achieve them. And the most common objective that we always ask people to take a step back on is their invasive species related objectives, because it's really common just to say, like, man, I don't like invasive species. I want them all gone. And your objective is eradication. Well, when we're thinking about the pressures of climate change and, the more hospitable conditions that will be presented for these invasive species, we may want to reevaluate that objective of eradication, because we may not have the capacity to fully eradicate a species in the landscape. And we might have to open that up a little to maybe, no greater than 10% of the landscape is covered by this invasive species. Give yourself a little bit of room in case things just take off. So that's one example of how you can go back and think about your goals and objectives in light of climate change. Okay, if you have any questions related to step 3, please reach out to us. We asked you to talk about them in discussion, but we sort of understood that you didn't have a lot of time to think about it before we forced that upon you in our discussion last Tuesday and Wednesday. So after you've had some time to reflect, if you want to, just send us a note with some questions, or maybe with what you found, we'd love to hear about it. So thanks. This week is step 4. So I would say you've gotten through sort of like the hard stuff, and now you're entering into the fun part. So it's sort of like you were like climbing the ladder to get to the really fun slide at the water park. Despite, E. coli and stuff, you're at the water park and you're here to have fun. So step 4 is all about, thinking about how you're going to respond to those climate pressures over time. What are you going to do? Now you're in the driver's seat and you're really documenting that road forward. The key ideas that we're here to talk about are related to this question. What actions can we take to enhance the ability of the system or the project area to adapt to anticipated changes and meet our management goals and objectives? So it's sort of taking that straight line look back to step 1, and you're putting it all into picture, and it all comes into focus. And you're like, oof, I think I have an understanding of how I can, continue with my momentum, continue to meet goals and objectives despite those challenges, those bumps in the road. And this is where you get to really describe that. So, what we're here is this step is really all about getting to work. And it's about, it's sort of the fun part. It's your choose your own adventure part. And, this is where you really get to document what it looks like for you in the future. What's your plan? How are you going to respond to these climate vulnerabilities? Now, some folks in the room are sort of those advanced folks who are super ready to go. But we do want to recognize that for some of us, this step can feel really overwhelming, and you might feel like sort of like you're being dumped into the deep end, less fun than the choose your own adventure. And it might feel really challenging to chart that path forward. And so part of what we're going to be talking about today is just, uncovering some of those tools that you do have that can help you in that brainstorming process. So the biggest tool that we have that will really help to, get the wheels turning and getting you thinking about different climate adaptation options and even on the ground tactics are our adaptation menus of strategies and approaches. And in this step, we're really getting you into a position where you can use those to your advantage. Now, a menu, we'll crib this idea by calling it a menu, but a menu as defined by us is really this resource of possible actions that you could take. And it's a huge list of ideas, and these ideas have been curated by literature reviewing and combing through the available literature to figure out what kind of climate adaptation strategies and approaches are really relevant to this topic area, especially of forest carbon. And so each of our menus are geared in that way, where we're looking at forested watersheds, agriculture, urban health, and we're thinking about adaptation options that are relevant to that type of location and set of conditions. Now, adaptation options, or the menus for which we've created, are in one way or another just like a menu at a restaurant. And so we have a collection of ideas that are specific to a discipline, but just like at a restaurant, you're not really going to order everything off the menu, right? You're going to want to review the menu and find a couple of items that sound really good to you. And so when you look at these adaptation menus, at first you might say, whoa, there's too much information here. But what we want you to do is to really sort of hone in and to find ideas that seem really relevant to you and resonate with what you're trying to do on the landscape, or maybe might help you overcome some of those climate challenges that you've addressed in step 3. All of the adaptation menus are in one way or another organized into a hierarchy. It's not super distinct. Sometimes there's some gray areas between ideas, but they do work you through this idea of resistance, resilience, and transition. And I'll define those ideas in just a minute. But it gets you through that spectrum of, maybe a defensive idea all the way to a more proactive and change-oriented idea. And one thing you will notice is that the menus themselves, we're not advocating or recommending any ideas. And so you might actually find some really opposing ideas within the menu. And that's because we want just to put as many ideas forward as we can so that you feel like you have the biggest set of options in front of you as you just, you pick and choose what seems relevant to you and curate your own management plan for climate change. Now, adaptation menus are really neat because they have so many different benefits based on your perspective. We may have, as scientists, as researchers, we may have thought of adaptation menus as having, one very specific benefit, which is, like we've combed the literature and we've found these great ideas. But what we have found is that other folks see benefits in adaptation menus as well, such as using them as learning tools, right? So you're reading through and you're really thinking differently, maybe about forest management in the context of forest carbon adaptation and mitigation. You're helping to connect those broad ideas of climate change adaptation to on-the-ground actions. For other folks, it can help to really clarify thinking and to make the actions seem, more tangible, and can help put in concert your intentions to say, well, that's exactly what I want to do. That's the elevator pitch that I've been trying to say all of this time. And that gets us to another idea, that adaptation menus on their own are great standalone tools for communication. So, if you want to bring this to a roundtable of your colleagues just to discuss what these ideas might look like in your broader management, they're just a really neat tool to spark some creative ideas. So I have been sort of focusing on the forest carbon menu, but I do want to let you know that you're allowed to use any menu that we have available to us. And we have menus that are included in the online workbook and those that are actually outside of the workbook. But all of them are fair game for this course. So don't feel like you have to use just the forest carbon menu. You can use whatever one you want. I know that some folks are very interested in the tribal adaptation menu, and that's one that you can absolutely use. And we can help you find the right links so that you can check that out. There are menus included in the adaptation workbook for all of these topics. So forestry, urban forestry, agriculture, recreation, wildlife management, and soon we'll get the fire one included, but probably not enough time for you to use that now. So as you're moving through the workbook, you don't have to do anything different, but you'll see these drop downs appear. And so it's just letting you know that these all come from peer-reviewed, published resources that are online and included in the workbook. And you can read more about each of these strategies in your syllabus as well. So big, broad picture is what I just sort of painted, hopefully got you curious and interested. And that's just to set up Todd for tomorrow. So we really hope that you do have time to join us in our optional session where we'll go into a ton of detail on forest carbon, and Todd's like sweating it. But this is going to be a really nice opportunity for you to learn more about this menu, learn why it was created, who created it, and some examples. And then it's also just a nice opportunity for you to ask questions too. So definitely come. We'll use the same URL that you're using now to attend this lecture. Okay, so as part of the course syllabus, you may have seen that we are encouraging you to think about adaptation actions. And what does that mean? Well, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail outlining adaptation options here because we do actually ask you to watch a video, a recorded video that goes into even more details. And you can find that in your course syllabus. But when we're talking about adaptation, we're really talking about this spectrum of ideas. So on one end, these are like big lofty ideas. On one end, we're talking about actions that we can take that will help our ecosystem, help to reduce those climate change impacts. But in one way or another, will help to maintain those current conditions, that character, that function on the landscape. And those actions generally fall into this big lofty idea called resistance, where we're helping to take steps that will improve the defenses of the forest against changes and disturbance. You can imagine we're saying we're going to put that forest into a bubble. Maybe it's for a certain amount of time. We're going to defend that ecosystem for the next 10 years so that we can reach some goal, whatever it is. But it's just saying we're going to put all of our capacity into maintaining that system. As you move down the line, we're really looking at more forward-looking ideas that help to promote change, be it resilience or transition. Resilience ideas are are somewhere in the middle of persistence versus change, but are often more persistence oriented, where we're seeking to accommodate some degree of change, but we do really want that system to return back to its previous state following a disturbance. So it's like a perforated bubble we're allowing on that system. We're saying we kind of want you still to be the same, but we're not going to wholly commit to resistance. We're going to allow some change to occur, but bounce back over time. And then you get to transition, where we're talking about intentionally facilitating that change and enabling ecosystems to respond to that new projected condition, or setting it up so it can better cope with those conditions over time. So according to my notes, I wasn't supposed to go into that much detail, but I did. And so you can find even more details in our very short video, which does provide some really great examples and further defines what resistance, resilience, and transition are. So all of this is to say that, the process that you're going through is a logical train of thought. It's an adaptive management process, and that the adaptation menus that we're studying right now are key to helping connect the dots between, and to help making our ideas more specific while connecting the dots between climate vulnerabilities, risks, and challenges to our responses. So adaptation menus really help to clarify this part of our thinking. It's to say adaptation menus are helping to define the intention of what we're doing. It helps to make our ideas more specific and really gets us down the road to being ultra specific about that action we're planning to take on the ground. So they're very vitally important. But as we get down that road, we do want to point out that when we're talking about adaptation actions, we don't really want you to feel this intense pressure to come up with something brand new. It's more saying, as you're looking at the actions that you might take to help the ecosystem overcome these climate vulnerabilities and challenges, it's okay if some of them are the same actions that you may already be using, right? Some of the same tools. It's more just we're asking you to think about, how does climate change make those tools even more important than ever before? And where do we have some flexibility to use those tools in times, maybe spatially, in different places, or temporally at different times of the year than we would traditionally. So if you're already following good conservation, sustainable forest management, a lot of the adaptation actions that you develop will seem really similar, but hopefully they'll be applied, with that intention as it's relating to, helping the ecosystem overcome those climate change vulnerabilities and challenges. It is rare that folks come up with something completely new and different. So just take that pressure right off your shoulders. Like that's not what we're here to do. But what we're here to do is ensure that our actions are directly connected to our climate vulnerabilities and challenges. Okay, so now I'm going to get boring really quick and talk about definitions, but they're important definitions. In step 4, and I've sort of thrown out some of these ideas, but I haven't defined them. So in step 4, we are talking about our adaptation menus. Menus have strategies, they have approaches, and then they have tactics. What you will commonly be looking for are approaches. And approaches you'll find in your adaptation menu. You can pick any of them that seem to make sense and that help to address your biggest challenges. What we don't give you are tactics. So we'll have a menu, it'll have a big idea, strategy, next idea, tiered below is approach, but you won't find tactics. We'll have example tactics, but it's really up to you to develop that tactic, because the tactic is the most customized and specific action that you can take, and it really expresses what you're going to do on the ground. So all the sort of the main pursuit of what we're doing here is detailing the what, where, and how in our plan. Okay, so you are developing tactics, sort of the focus of your week. We'll also ask you to think about timeframes. And so you might take tactics in different timeframes. You may even want to think about it in phases. In the near term, I'm going to take this tactic. Based on the results of that tactic, at this time frame, I'll do this. So really start thinking specifically about those timeframes and try to be as detailed as possible. One interesting thing when we're talking about climate adaptation planning, we really feel like it's important to intentionally address both, what we're going to do on the landscape and why, but also the benefits and the drawbacks. And so you will have an opportunity to define the benefits of this tactic. Why is it good? Why should you be encouraging your organization or yourself or others to continue using this tactic? And so, for example, maybe the benefit of that tactic is that it addresses, your biggest challenges, or it's cheap and easy and effective, right? Or it has co-benefits or it's likely to succeed. These are all really valid, but I think really important to document so others can read your plan and fully understand why you're taking that tactic. Next, we don't want to have too big of an ego, so we should also describe why in some cases that tactic may not be so good. Be really clear about, what those drawbacks are. Maybe it has negative side effects, maybe it's kind of risky, but it's important and something we should prioritize. Maybe it requires too much effort or costs a lot. This could be like a summer harvest, right? Like you want to do the summer harvest, but you're sort of stating that it will come at an added cost. It may not be successful. It has social, financial, or other barriers. Okay, so be really intentional and pretty transparent when you're developing your tactics. Next, we'll ask about practicability. So you might want to practice saying that word. I have to. Practicability. And this is saying, is your tactic both effective, that it will meet your desired intention, and also feasible of being implemented? So you can understand why that's a nice leveling variable to say, what's the bottom line here? Is it practical? Is it both effective and feasible? You will say either yes, it has high practicability, maybe moderate, because it will require some additional effort, or maybe it has low practicability. The barriers and drawbacks are just too big. You may find that you come up with tactics that are too pie in the sky, and we want you to sort of document all of these ideas, because you don't have to recommend every tactic. Maybe you have a series of tactics where it's like you have plan A, plan B, plan C, and plan D. And maybe some of those tactics that are the further down the list you wouldn't recommend now, but you want it detailed in your plan so that somebody can see that you did consider it and fully understand what those drawbacks were and why you didn't want to prioritize it. So look for this option within the adaptation workbook. Okay, so before I get into an example, if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I don't know if anything's coming in, but Todd and Luke can help to answer those.
Nothing so far.
Great, thanks, Todd. Okay. Okay, so now we have an interesting example. So in each of our courses, we try to provide as many examples as we can so that you can sort of see yourself and it relates to, what you're trying to do. Lucky for you, this example is super brand new. It's been around for a while, but it's brand new to the website, actually coming online only a few days ago. So Todd's here to help me if I'm not able to fully describe it. But this first case study I'm going to share with you is a really great example of how, of a manager who's trying to make an adjustment to their plans based on their assessment of climate risk. And so many of you might fall into this bin actually, where, the big question here for you maybe, can you address climate vulnerabilities that are on site while also incorporating considerations of a broader vision towards adaptation and mitigation. And in this case, we're really looking at a huge invasive problem that's not going to go away. So I like this example because it's sort of the manager saying like, well, I'm at a T here. I have to do something. And so how do I achieve that long-term vision while accepting that I might have some near-term issues that are going to be pretty detrimental? So this site is actually located pretty far north. It's the Whaelghin. Can you say it for me, Todd, please?
Whaelghinbran.
Whaelghinbran, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, just like it looks, obviously.
Clearly. Okay, so this is the Whaelghinbran Forest. It's located in New Brunswick in the Acadian Forest. It's 693 acres. And it's a pretty interesting project because it's a pilot project that is helping to demonstrate voluntary carbon offsetting for private woodlot owners through improved forest management. And so I think a lot of you might fall into this idea of thinking. The property has a 20-acre pure hemlock stand that obviously has a lot of carbon. And so the manager that we worked with really wanted to be proactive in their management to not only mitigate the very probable effects of hemlock woolly adelgid, while also achieving that long-term vision, to sustain carbon on the landscape. So the goals of this project over 20 or so acres are to improve the resistance of some portion of the mature hemlock to hemlock woolly adelgid. And saying like, can we get that stand as healthy as we can so that it will persist longer despite hemlock woolly adelgid coming to the stand. Next, they want to increase the species diversity within the stand to ultimately maintain those carbon stocks as they know the hemlock may fluctuate. And they are actually enrolled in a voluntary offset program. The main climate change impacts relate to, warming winters, longer growing seasons, increased insect pests from northward expansion, primarily the hemlock woolly adelgid that is anticipated to arrive in the next 10 years, and also that increased frequency and intensity of precipitation, which, if not planned for, could be extremely detrimental to, a forest that is recovering or trying to regenerate post insect and pest expansion and invasion. So, that is to say, before we get into this, here's step one, and I actually omitted step 3, but you have step 1, your management goals, you have step 2, your climate change impacts, and I did omit the challenges and opportunities here, but you can imagine the biggest challenge is that their whole forest is likely to be decimated by a really terrible insect, the hemlock woolly adelgid. The tactics that this manager identified included first harvesting up to 30% of the overstory to open up the canopy in order to improve the ability of the remaining mature trees to resist hemlock woolly adelgid, followed by encouraging or establishing some climate adapted species, the regeneration or planting to diversify the stand. But I do want to focus on this idea of harvesting 30% of the overstory. This might seem sort of counterintuitive because it's hemlock, it's a shade tolerant forest. You wouldn't think that opening it up would actually be a good idea. But this tactic is supported by some researchers, and you can download this publication on your own. It is free access. So it was supported by Brantley et al., who found that management actions that increase light on infested hemlocks can actually reduce the effects of hemlock woolly adelgid infestation on the hemlock carbon balance. So really interesting ideas here. So, increasing the light level improves that long-term carbon balance for the hemlock seedlings in the presence of hemlock woolly adelgid. Very interesting. Go ahead.
Just jump in here to add one other point, which is, this is, given that this is a carbon offsets project, they normally wouldn't have made a decision to do any harvesting. And so this is really a departure from what kind of their normal kind of project management would be, which is to just let the hemlock continue growing and storing carbon on the site. And it was done in response to this recognition that they likely needed to do something proactive to kind of mitigate the probable impacts of the insect. And just, looking around at sort of what were their options, this paper, this Brantley et al. Paper was an interesting, presented them with an interesting option.
Yeah, absolutely. Another tactic, so they're not only thinking about, so they have this forest carbon offset project, which you would imagine is just afforestation or like trying to keep the forest healthy. But as Todd pointed out, the property managers wanted to mitigate the near-term effects in order to sort of get the project back on track. And so another idea was to also encourage species diversity, and establish future adapted species. And so you can see here that they're favoring existing species that are better adapted to future conditions and may even introduce species that are expected to be better adapted. And all of this is, coming from the carbon menu. One of the most common improved forest management practices for carbon offsets is to extend rotations, right? And so this makes a lot of sense. We want to keep things growing. And this makes a lot of sense when your forest has low vulnerability, right? So it has low vulnerability. You don't expect the forest health to decline, and so you wouldn't expect that carbon losses would decline from disturbances that are not necessarily out of the ordinary, right? And so we can think about extending that period between harvest entry in order to increase stand stocking levels. So you would sort of, limit your entries in order to let the forest grow, and then you can imagine more carbon would be stored. But in this project, it's a really great example of the opposite. When vulnerability is super high, there actually may be a greater carbon value in shorter rotations or reduced stocking in order to transition those stands and kind of jumpstart the system back onto, a better path towards better carbon storage on the landscape. Now, this project just came online and you can go and check it out. But it is a really interesting example of how, maybe a management plan may depart from sort of what you would imagine that logical sequence would sort of get you to when you're in the realm of carbon thinking. Lastly, did want to just share that they have a pretty robust idea for how they will monitor the and evaluate the effectiveness of these adaptation actions over time. So We want you to establish, what you will do in response to climate change and how you will help that ecosystem cope with climate change in order to meet your long-term carbon goals. But we also will ask you next week how you'll monitor the effectiveness of those ideas. This is a sort of a sneak peek. And this project, very robust. Basically, they plan to enter the forest several times. Todd was saying this could be based on, the program that they're enrolled in, that they need to be in there every 7 years. But what we wanted to show was that when they enter the forest, they're looking at the forest from several different lenses. One being forest health, how are the trees doing? We're looking at tree species composition. We're looking at stand composition and really evaluating that percentage of climate adapted tree species that we're hoping to encourage. We're looking at seedling survival, regeneration, and then we're also taking a sort of forest carbon perspective here to say that when they enter the forest, again, for their monitoring, they're really looking at how the evaluating the tree composition in those carbon stocks to evaluate how much carbon has been removed from that first harvest and how much is being replaced through the ongoing growth and sequestration across the property. So just to put this out there, you can read more about this story, but when you're thinking about monitoring, especially in the context of carbon, there may need to be several different lenses that needs to be applied to these forest inventories over time. Okay, so questions we'll save, I suppose. I really ripped through this presentation, so I feel like there's going to be some questions. Just for the folks who I guess are reviewing the recording, I'm going to jump into Adaptation Workbook online tutorials, and then we'll return to questions about the content. So Adaptation Workbook tutorials and pro tips. First, have you logged in? Second, do you see a menu on the sidebar that asks you about homework? If you do not, you're not enrolled in our course, and I can help you associate your project to the course. That's really not a big deal, but I just need an email from you in order to know that you're experiencing that. Okay, next, step 4. Before you really dive into step 4 on the online workbook, we do want you to sit with this course syllabus. Really look through the material, find the links to the adaptation menu, read about it, read about other menus, and then sort of go to the adaptation workbook. Because when you get there, there will be some shortcuts that will help to enable those connections to be made, but it may not help with on-the-go learning. Okay, so when you're in the adaptation workbook, remember that you can choose from any menu when you're selecting a strategy and approach, and associate a tactic to that, and then determine if you're going to recommend or not recommend that tactic. There is a nice tutorial, a sort of a cookbook way of going through the workbook. If you haven't downloaded that already, I highly recommend. So what does it look like? Well, when you're in the adaptation workbook, again, you should see homework appear here. If you don't, then that means you're not connected. When you're in step 4, you will see some buttons that will help you quickly jump to all of the menus that are included in the workbook. Here, this must be an old screenshot because we don't have the urban climate and health or the wildlife menu or the carbon menu, but it's there. So when you want to just read about one of these menus, you can click and an interactive menu will appear that you can sort of toggle through and check out different tactic examples. But if you're ready to just create a tactic, all you have to do is go to Add Tactic, and a pop-up will appear that looks like this. It will really take over your screen. What you'll do is interact with this pop-up, and you'll go up to the top and select the menu that you're looking for, then select the strategy, then select the approach, and then fill in all of the details below, the tactical details, the benefits, the drawbacks, your time frame, and practicability. I kind of think you should probably look at each menu on its own and highlight the approaches that seem most relevant to you so that it's easier to find if you're using more than one menu. Here. Final piece is to decide if you are recommending this tactic. Like I said, you don't have to. You can have lots of different tactics and several of them are not recommended, but as a default, they are all recommended. Now, you may choose to not recommend based on institutional policies in your organization or just writ large within your state, especially related to assisted migration. There are some rules that are something you might want to look into. But take advantage of this comment box to explain why this tactic is not recommended for that objective. As always, I highly recommend that you check out these videos because we recorded them as like a really nice way to like remind you how to move through the step. So you don't have to read anything, you can just watch the cursor, and it's really helpful. Also, if you find that you just need to get stuff out of the way so you can get to work, make sure you use these little caret buttons to push all of this material up. And if you're looking for a snapshot on how far you have gotten through the workbook, if you go to progress summary, you'll work that you've done in each of the steps. It's a pretty handy dashboard. Okay, so our assignment for next time we meet, so from now until then, complete any work you haven't completed, please. Then really sit down with that course syllabus and start with that short video on adaptation concepts. So give yourself like an hour. Adaptation concepts is 27 minutes long, and then start, really thinking about those tactics that you might take. Start checking out menus, see how the tactics align with different approaches, and you're well on your way. Check out the course syllabus to find the menus, but also some really cool demonstration projects, including one that is curated by our co-host Luke Nave for the Aspen experimental site at the Michigan State Biological Station. So some really, I don't know, Luke, you know it. Anyways, it's in there. It's in the course syllabus. I butchered it. It's not my project, and I'm sorry. But you should check it out. And so complete all this by next Monday. Please join our optional session tomorrow for a really cool presentation by Todd. But if you can't, it'll be recorded and we'll include it in our newsletter so you can watch it at your own convenience. And looking ahead, we will meet again next Monday to talk about monitoring. That's all I've got for today. I hope you're having an awesome day, and please feel free to stay after if you've got any questions.